Chapter 3 examines the scalp. The study objective here is to describe the structure of the scalp. The scalp consists of 5 layers. These can be remembered conveniently by spelling the word scalp. Layer 1, the S layer, consists of the skin. Layer 2, the C layer, consists of connective tissue. Layer 3, the A layer, consists of the aponeurosis of the epicranius muscle. Layer 4, the L layer, consists of loose connective tissue. Layer 5, the P layer, consists of the pericranium. The S layer is composed of the skin. Most of this usually is hair-bearing. The C layer consists of connective tissue. This is a dense, fatty, or fibroadipose subcutaneous layer that forms the superficial fascia of the scalp. It is attached tightly to both the overlying skin and the underlying epicranius, thus binding these 3 layers into a single functional unit. This layer contains numerous blood vessels and nerves, and we will look at these in detail in subsequent chapters. The fibrous tissue in the C layer tends to hold apart the edges of wounds, including the cut ends of severed vessels. Thus, there is typically a gaping opening and profuse bleeding in scalp wounds. Layer 3, the A layer, consists of the aponeurosis of the epicranius muscle. The epicranius consists of the frontalis and occipitalis muscles and the broad aponeurosis that connects them. This large sheet is responsible for movement of the scalp. We will look at this layer more closely in the following chapter on facial muscles. Layer 4, the L layer, consists of loose connective tissue. This is termed the subaponeurotic areolar space. It holds the epicranial aponeurosis to the underlying periosteum. The loose nature of this tissue layer imparts several functional features. First, this is the plane of movement of the scalp. That is, when the scalp moves, the SCA layers slide together along this zone relative to the underlying periosteum. Second, this is the common site of collection and spreading of blood or infection within the intact scalp. Third, this layer is easily torn in accidents, thus avulsing the SCA layers together when the scalp is torn off. In a similar fashion, this is basically what was done when people were scalped. With tension applied via the hair, a cut was made down to bone, and the SCA layers were ripped off the skull along the natural plane of separation of the loose connective tissue layer. Another functional feature of the L layer is that this layer is easily incised. This allows the SCA layers to be turned down as a single layer in surgical exposures. I've made a scalpel incision through the scalp, a coronal section across the top of the skull, and a sagittal section down the center of the forehead, matching up with our coronal section. Now what I'm going to do here, in order to show the L loose connective tissue layer of the scalp, is to lift up our first flap, peel this back a bit gently, and what we can see already is the spongy loose connective tissue that makes up the L layer of the scalp. What I can do here is just start to gently incise through this layer, and the point of this again is to show that we can cut very easily across this L layer and reflect the scalp downward very readily. For surgical approaches to the skull, this is an important aspect of the anatomy because again the scalp can be removed very nicely. Because the neurovascular pedicles that feed the scalp are coming in from multiple directions, the scalp can maintain itself. We can peel the scalp literally down across the forehead, exposing the skull, again for very nice, easy surgical approaches to the skull and to beyond the skull itself. Layer 5, the P layer, consists of the pericranium. This is the periosteum of the outer surface of the skull bones. The pericranium forms a distinct tissue layer across the roof of the skull. In dissection, it can be easily peeled off to reveal underlying bony features, as shown in the following video clip. All right, so what I've done is to continue removing scalp flaps as we started with on an earlier sequence. We have two frontal flaps that are now pulled down over the eyes, and we've taken the back flaps off the skull and pulled them way back as well. We can see that remaining on the surface of the skull, there are remnants of the L layer, the loose connective tissue on the surface of the skull. And then beneath that, and tightly applied to the exterior of the bony layer of the skull here, we'll have the fifth and final layer of the scalp, the P or periosteal layer. And what I'm going to do is come in right into the center on the top of the skull, onto the vertex area, and I'm going to lift some of this combination of loose connective tissue that's here and cut right down against the bone and literally scrape this tissue away from the surface of the bone. Again, I can lift up some of this, and when I get right onto the bone, I do get a kind of a flap-like or a layer-like arrangement that I can pull off, but for the most part, we have to literally scrape this tissue off the surface of the skull. Again, there's a little bit of the loose connective tissue layer in here, but most of what I'm scraping off now is actually the P layer, the periosteal layer on the exterior of the skull. And what we'll want to do in our dissections is to remove this across the surface of the skull. Now, in most cadavers, at this point, what we would be able to start seeing is sutures on the exterior of the skull. However, on this individual, who's quite old, we can see that the sutures are already obliterated. This would be one of the normal consequences of old age, is that eventually the sutures of the skull will completely obliterate. Perhaps if we look real closely right along the scalpel blade here, we might be able to make out the remnant. This might not show up very well on the camera. There's barely a little remnant of a suture line across here. But again, for all intents and purposes, these sutures have been obliterated. In many cadavers, again, we should be able to hopefully still make out the coronal suture running across the front of the skull and part of the sagittal suture running back down from behind that. But we don't really have much to see in this in terms of that. And the most important thing we wanted to point out was the nature of the periosteal layer of the scalp tightly applied to the exterior of the bone, and that can in fact be peeled back off the exterior of the bone.